everyone, I'm Maggie McGrath, editor of ForbesWomen. On Saturday, equal pay advocate Lilly Ledbetter passed away at the age of 86. She was a groundbreaking figure in this arena. She was on the 2021 Forbes 50 over 50 list for her work in advocating for equal pay for equal work. Joining us now to talk about the legacy that Lilly leaves with all of us is Noreen Farrell. She's the executive director of Equal Rights Advocates. Noreen, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start broadly for folks who might only be vaguely familiar with Lilly's name and legacy. Can you give us the 60-second rundown of exactly what she did and why she is so important?
Well, Lilly never set out to be a trailblazer, but she became one. She worked at Goodyear Tire in Alabama for 19 years, and she discovered through an anonymous note that she was being paid thousands of dollars less per year as a manager there. And as soon as she found out, she filed a lawsuit for pay discrimination, and she actually won at the lower court. But ultimately, her case went all the way to the Supreme Court, where it was overturned because the court said that Lilly should have filed on the first paycheck in which she was discriminated against. And it's really not fair because most women and others don't know that they're being discriminated against in pay. And that was remedied through an act in Congress signed by President Obama in 2009, the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act, which said, no, you don't have to file after the first paycheck, but the last paycheck you receive. So every paycheck you receive where there's pay inequity, that restarts the time for you to seek redress in the courts. And it really paved the way for millions of people who followed her.
Noreen, that's a really interesting point. And I'm wondering, do we know how many people exactly have taken advantage of that law since President Obama signed it into law in 2009?
Well, I've been a litigator for 25 years doing thousands of cases, and among them many pay equity cases, including ones that went to the Supreme Court. And so it's really not calculable how many people per year, but I would say tens of thousands. And that's not even the true impact, because knowing what the law is now has been such an incredible deterrent to employers to make sure that every one of its paychecks are fair. It's also spurred dozens of laws across the country requiring pay transparency. So you can actually know what the pay scales are of your job. And that kind of pay secrecy is what really festered in Lilly's case. So it's not just the people who are getting to court, which is significant, but it's all of those who benefited from the laws that followed because of Lilly's legacy.
I'm glad you mentioned pay transparency, because when we talk about the gender pay gap, there are so many factors that go into it. There is the basic discrimination aspect. Then there are the inherited salaries that happen when people move from company to company. And when you're asking a woman, what did you make in your last job? And if you pay her that rate, you're probably inheriting the pay gap from the prior company. We'll get into other policies that can help close the pay gap. But just to continue on Lilly's legacy, do you have a good sense for how many regular Americans, people who aren't working in this space like you are, know her name and know what she's done for the people of this country?
Well, I think the reason why she's such a galvanizing figure is because she made her story available to millions across the country. She took every press interview. She took her case all the way to the Supreme Court. She was the first bill that President Obama signed. And she's made herself accessible year after year as we mark the continued pay gap. So I think it's safe to say that she really is well known, and she's certainly well known to those who've ever experienced unfairness in their workplace or in their life. And I think that's why she's just such an inspiration to so many of us.
Am I correct in saying that you knew her and you had personal interactions with Lilly?
I'm so honored to say I did know Lilly personally. She became a great friend over the years. She, like I said, she would come to any event where the voice of a really common, typical, warm worker was needed to attest to the legal reform that was needed. I launched a campaign called Equal Pay Today shortly after passage of the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act. In fact, we just had a great anniversary of that act last year in January, and she wasn't able to make it personally because of some health issues, but she participated in a statement, and she was there, and she was felt. And so it's been 15 years of getting to know her really well and continuing to be inspired by her, not just today, but I think for a lot of things to come.
What is something that wouldn't show up in the typical obituary about Lilly that you want the audience to know? Maybe a personal tick that she had, or an anecdote that stands out that might not be about advocacy, but about her as a person.
Lilly had an incredible warmth. She, despite all the obstacles she faced in her life, had an amazing sense of humor, which she would bring to all of her activism. She loved telling the story about being able to dance with President Obama. She loved telling the story about how she felt when she stood behind him as he paid that act. And to be in a place where most Americans don't feel that they belong, she made us feel like the White House is our White House. It's our White House. It's a place where laws can change to help everyone. She had a wonderful accent from Alabama. She told great stories about her workplace. And I think it's important to remember that she was also a manager in a tire plant in Alabama, in the 80s. And so she was an incredible force in the workplace, a woman ahead of her time. And I think it showed in how she lived the rest of her life.
You started this conversation by saying she never sought out to be an advocate, and all of this kind of started with an anonymous note. Did she ever find out who wrote that note?
If she did, she never told us. She was a person of great discretion, and I think she always really felt a soft spot for the person that left her that note. So many of the people that we represent find out at the water cooler or when they're retired and see what kind of retirement package they get. And, it really was an act of kindness. Today, that kind of pay secrecy where people are retaliated against for talking about pay is prohibited in many states. There's a new act before Congress, the Paycheck Fairness Act, which would prohibit retaliation against people who talk about pay. And so hopefully the circumstances that led to her finding this out anonymously really will change in the years to come as we pass that federal law.
Now, when President Obama signed the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act as his first act of president in 2009, it was a landmark moment. But many years have passed since. And what's your sense, Noreen, of how tired the American public is when it comes to talking about the pay gap? Because it continues to exist. So have people reached a saturation point, and do they not want to hear about it anymore?
I think the great galvanizing piece about pay equity is that it can be measured in dollars and cents. And so when we explain to people that's 3 months of rent, that's the first year of a community college, that's a down payment in a house, that's $100,000, $200,000, $500,000 over the course of the year, it really perks up everyone's interest, and not just women, but men and entire families who rely on dual incomes often. And what we've seen, especially in this younger generation, is this demand to know what other people make. It's been a cultural zeitgeist, which I think has really fueled a new era of laws. And I really think wage equity, what's in people's pockets, so they don't have to work paycheck to paycheck, continues to be an incredibly strong desire by all Americans, no matter what political party. And I think we'll continue to see that.
And to your point, we do see data indicating that pay is not equal in the United States. We had equal pay day for all women on March 12th this year, which means that's the date that women must work into the new year to make what a man made in the prior year. But when you break that down by demographics, Latina equal pay day was October 3rd, and Native American women equal pay day is, I think, November 21st. So, Noreen, what are the policies, laws, or cultural changes that are necessary to really bring pay equity to the United States?
You're right. Women of color are still making up what men made last year, and it's a devastating statistic. I think there's a couple of factors. One, we need to make sure that everyone understands that women are segregated into the lowest paid work. Women make up 2/3 of the minimum wage earners in this country. So really making sure that we open access to higher wage jobs that are equitable, that allow women to balance family and their job. So policies like expanding access to childcare, making sure people have paid family leave, making sure that there isn't harassment on the job. these are the things that create economic mobility for women so they can enter into higher wage jobs and get promotions. And so it's really a comprehensive approach to pay equity and wage justice in the country. And there's organizations like mine that do that. There's a lot of bipartisan support for that. And we hope that after these elections that all of our legislators actually follow through with those promises.
Now, of course, Lilly often talked about pay and wage discrimination. She was literally making less than her male counterparts. But a lot of the recent data we've seen around the pay gap in the United States comes down to the decision to have children and whether or not you have access to childcare. And there are parts of the wage gap that are driven by the fact that women might leave the workforce and take some time not being paid. How much did you and Lilly talk about that, and how much does the state of paid family leave here in the country factor into the pay gap?
You know, Lilly herself was a mother, a working mother. She understood the demands of that in her own workplace. She really lent her name to all of the contributors to the gap in terms of finding the solutions. I think it's also true that women hit a motherhood penalty. So even if they're hired and they have PTA on their resume, studies show they're paid less. So there is both the issue of being forced out of the workplace because of lack of childcare, but also just the fact of having children. There's studies that show that after women came back into the workforce after COVID, if they were mothers, they had a higher wage penalty. They couldn't get back to the same wage, or they were relegated to part-time work, which of course impacts people's overall wages. So this is a big picture. Lilly was at the center of it. She was our greatest cheerleader and our most courageous fighter. And we have a lot of work ahead, but the solutions are really common sense, and they're on the table for the taking.
She was a tremendous cheerleader for this issue, and she leaves a big gap. But I'm wondering, are there activists that you look at who have been molded in Lilly's image, who will carry her legacy forward?
You know, I represented women who worked for Walmart. I know Betty Dukes was somebody who, was a Walmart greeter who dealt with pay discrimination. But, we have to look at really amazing low-wage women workers like the domestic workers and janitors, and those who are really talking about making sure that there isn't wage injustice, that there's overtime paid. So there is a new generation of women, and we find them in every sector of our workplace. And I think that's when really the momentum starts. And I think we're really at a pivot point for the movement because of that.
You mentioned the Paycheck Fairness Act. What else is your organization doing right now or advocating for that would help eliminate the pay gap in the United States?
Well, there's a number of policies. The first is California was one of the first states in the country to require the posting of salary ranges to prohibit the reliance on prior salary in setting pay, as you mentioned, and also requiring employers of a certain size to collect data by race and sex and ethnicity and report that to government agencies to track trends. Those are the kind of bills with a lot of corporate support. We have a lot of corporate allies here in California that we are trying to replicate in states across the country, as of course we wait for Congress to get together and really decide on some important federal legislation. That legislation will not only include the Paycheck Fairness Act, but raise the wage acts and efforts to really stop the sub-minimum wage for tipped workers, which is really a poverty wage in many service industries. There's the Be Heard Act at the federal level, which is addressing not just that sub-minimum wage, but also harassment in the workplace. So there's a lot of really innovative, powerful bills that are in play in states across the country and in Congress.
We've covered a lot of ground. Is there anything else the Forbes audience should know about Lilly Ledbetter or about your work at the Equal Rights Advocates?
I think the audience should know there's something that all of us can do as employers, as women business leaders setting policy, promoting transparency, making sure that people are paid their merit. But there's also ways for you to advocate for really great legislation. We have an action team. There's ways you can get involved locally and also in your workplace. Be transparent about your pay. Ask about what are the factors that go into your pay range and advocate for yourself with the help of advocates that know the law.
Noreen Farrell, Executive Director of Equal Rights Advocates, thank you so much for joining us and talking about Lilly Ledbetter's legacy. We so appreciate your time.
Thank you. It was such an honor to talk about that incredible trailblazer.